IH's last edition of Chandrabhaga.
Yeah, now, Ashwini ji, now it is streaming live. I request all the honorable members to mute themselves whenever we call. Kindly.
Namaste. Jayanta Mahapatra, a distinguished poet writing in English and Odia, and fellow of Sahitya Akademi, breathed his last on 27th of August. He was 95. He authored 27 books of poems, of which 7 are in Odia and the rest in English. Jayanta experimented with forms of prose as well, and was also a distinguished editor, and was involved in the production of the literary journal Chandrabhaga. He translated from Odia to English. He received the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1981 for his collection of poems, Relationship. The other awards that he received for his immense literary contribution include Jacob Gladstone Memorial Award, Alan Tate Poetry Prize, Sark Literary Award, and Tata Literature Lifetime Award, and many others, of course. He was conferred with Padma Shri in 2009 and was awarded honorary doctorate by Ravenshaw University and a D.Litt by Utkal University, Odisha. Sahitya Akademi conferred its fellowship upon him in 2019. Sahitya Akademi also published Jayanta Mahapatra, a reader. In his acceptance speech delivered at the Sahitya Akademi Fellowship Presentation Ceremony, he said, which establishes his rare and sharp insight into poetry, I quote, "For me, however, poetry is first of all an expression of life. And because I believe that poetry comes out of life and not the other way around, I tend still to think that poetry is contained in the dust under our feet, muddy shoes, children and old people, skin and blood and tears, in grass and fireflies, and the blue of the sky itself. And yes, at times, newspapers and art and society. The best poetic subject is still the anti-poetic. The history of poetry is the history of the anti-poetic." Unquote. Today, we have with us eminent literateurs to remember and pay tribute to the distinguished poet. First, I request Dr. K. Srinivas Raoji, Secretary, Sahitya Akademi, to speak and open the meet. Dr. K. Srinivas Raoji.
Namaskar. Friends, India is the land of poetry, and there have been a number of poetic traditions and varieties of poets since times immemorial. Each poet and poetry tradition contributed to the enrichment of poetry of India. Each poet has a unique style and the way in which she or he approaches the subject at hand, independent of any precedence in the tradition they hail from. Professor Jayanta Mahapatra is one poet who stood out and paved his own path. He was the trendsetter and one of the very few who dared to walk down the path that was never traversed by anyone before. Professor Jayanta Mahapatra was a gentle giant who, along with a handful of others, shaped, defined, and gave direction to Indian English poetry in the 20th century. For that reason alone, he needs to be celebrated, and his legacy should be preserved for every poet of every generation in the future times for their benefit and for the benefit of the entire milieu. My personal opinion, eminent scholars here and elsewhere will have different opinions that Jayanta Mahapatra's contribution for the enrichment of Indian English poetry is second only after the contribution of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo's poetry was not cerebral by any stretch of imagination, but rooted deeply in the soil and the cultural roots, and the same can be said about Professor Jayanta Mahapatra. Professor Mahapatra was a poet of the soil in every sense of the word, and his poetry reflects this deep rootedness in every single line. I can share a number of his poems which are grand and at the same time reflects milieu of the region, and more than all this, one can easily trace the existentialist trait, I mean a focus or putting man at the center. In the words of Professor Jayanta Mahapatra himself, as my colleague has also mentioned, poetry gave me an opportunity to love people, to love my fellow beings. Professor Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry may be deeply rooted in the soil, but his Catholic in appeal, just by sheer number of universal elements in them and his heart for humanity. In all his poems, the scholarship of the man is unmistakable. Jayanta Mahapatra's poems created layers of sense through irony, understanding, and empathy. They carried a rich repertoire of memories, myths, imageries, and metaphors from many lands and cultures, especially from Odisha. They captured the lived experience in significant terms, creating their own poetic factors and also prophetic at times. His poetry went beyond the barriers, both figuratively and metaphorically. They were like the poet himself, gentle and yet making gigantic impact on the minds of the readers. That process also triggered creativity and imagination among scores of young people through decades, and the result was the emergence of fresh voices that were deep philosophically and empathetic to the current time at the same time. And that process happened uninterrupted for decades, and in fact, much better than any formal education system. I'm sure in the decades to come, too, millions will be impacted by the poetry of Professor Jayanta Mahapatra ji. The land of Odisha boasts of rare and rich literary heritage, from Jayadeva to Saraladasa to Fakir Mohan Senapati to the current generation of writers. Odisha continues to produce intellectuals and inspire many an Indian writer. Coincidentally, in the history of Sahitya Akademi, that it is the only in Odia that it had 4 living fellows at one of the time. There is Dr. Manoj Das, Ramakant Rath, Sitakant Mahapatra, and Jayanta Mahapatra. When we gave the fellowship to Jayanta Mahapatra, all these 4 people were, that is in no other language has represented such. Professor Jayanta Mahapatra leaves behind rich body of work and legacy, and looking up to him, trying to emulate his creativity and being kind to others and sensitive in oneself are some of the ways in which we can all pay tribute to Professor Jayanta Mahapatra. His death is an irreparable loss to all of us. I offer my heartfelt tributes to Professor Jayanta Mahapatra ji. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, may I invite Professor Mahalashri Lalji, eminent writer and convener of English Advisory Board of Sahitya.
Namaskar, everyone. It's indeed a very important moment for all of us to be together in remembering Professor Jayanta Mahapatra and his tremendous contribution to the development of Indian writing in English. He was a pathfinder in many ways, as Dr. Srinivas Rao just mentioned, and yet he was very deeply rooted to the soil of Odisha. The one poem that comes to my mind very often is Relationship, the volume that got for him the Sahitya Akademi Award. It's an old poem in his oeuvre, and yet for me, it lays down the fundamentals of what he believed in and what he strived for through the rest of his writing during his long life. There are a couple of elements in that poem that I wish to remind myself of, and I'm sure all of you will have your views on it. The first thing is to be rooted in the culture into which one is born. And that is where he traces the history, the ancient lineage of Orissa with great pride and with great understanding. The second is that he also sees the modern Orissa and the problems of poverty, of urbanization, of the rural marginalization that has happened, and he places it all in the context of the tradition of the old times. So, what I think I could learn from him deeply is that the past is extremely important in the mythology, in the legends, in the folklore, in the traditions and of the culture that one is born into. But equally, we have to apply it to our modern times and be aware of the social configurations in which we find ourselves. And in the context of the rural poverty that Jayant Mahapatra noticed, wrote about, and agonized over, we find some of his other significant poems. The poem Hunger is very well known to everybody. And there, when the eye of the poet takes one to the fisher folk in the village, and particularly to the women's issues, it is something that touches me deeply. In many, many ways, Professor Jayant Mahapatra's contribution and his leadership in the field of Indian writing in English was an absolute eye-opener for many of us when we were students. And as we continued to be adults and teachers ourselves, I think Mahapatra remained a permanent teacher for many of us. He certainly was so to me. So I am really grateful to the Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to pay a humble tribute to the memory and the legacy of Jayant Mahapatra. Namaskar.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. I now invite Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumarji, eminent poet, critic, and guest editor of Sahitya Akademi's bi-monthly Indian Literature.
Namaskar, everyone. It's a great privilege now, very, very great privilege to be talking about Jayanta Mahapatra. However, I know how much I'm missing him because there was almost a daily communication with me for the last many, many years. When he would, if not speak, he would send me text messages. And believe it or not, even those little images that he would send, full of love, compassion, humanity, connectedness, and always projecting a tremendous amount of zest for life. And imagine in the last 2 months, I don't know how many times he went into ICU and came back. It was almost an emergency for him all the time. The idea of not only going to ICU, but coming out of it. And, you know, in a way, we should have been prepared for his end because he was going into ICU thinking that, giving signals to the whole world that the world was coming to an end for him. But it seemed like a fresh beginning each time he came out. And he would write in his handwriting, he would write a poem or a translation of a poem and send it to Indian literature first and foremost. And I was getting worried that Rao Sahab was going to kick me out very soon if he sees so much of Jayanta Mahapatra, in Indian literature, because he was writing so prolific, even at the end. And when I was in the year's book with Vinita Agrawal, and we wanted one senior poet as a beacon light to the rest of the poets. And I was wondering what to do. And we wanted also, the condition was that there should be one poem already published during that 1 year, 22. And we were wondering if Jayanta would have any poem which would be published in that year. And why not? I mean, immediately I talked to him, and within 5 minutes, he took a photo of the poem that he had published in Hudson Review and immediately sent it. And imagine, I mean, even not only writing poetry, but also management of poetry. That was so beautifully being done by him, talking about his zest for life and so on. So on the one hand, that, on the other hand, he's one of those rare poets who had dug deep into both Odia as well as English. So having these two languages, a strong bilingualism, and that is why his Odia poem became very strong and his English poem became stronger, because there was a root that he could always stand on and therefore grow higher and higher into the skies. So sense of history, sense of culture, emotion, and reason, all of that came together along with the sense of tradition, which also went along with modernity. So this kind of a poet is a very rare thing. But on the other hand, there was also a beautiful innocence about him. One had to look at his expression to see how childlike he was. On the one hand, so childlike. On the other hand, when he would sit down to write poetry, it was oozing with a certain kind of wisdom and perception into what life is all about. So these kind of contradictions getting reconciled, it was absolutely beautiful. He wrote a poem called Playing the Magician, one of the later poems that he wrote, which is in the yearbook that we included, which was published in the Hudson Review. And this is what he was, playing the magician with poetry. And so we, as if we are working as critics, we might talk about eco-criticism, eco-lens that we might use. We might use the modernist kind of thing or traditionalist. What he would not fall into a single category is what I want to say. That was his holistic, on the one hand, the macro vision and the micro vision with which he dealt with the details. And a poem that was just referred to, Hunger, it is so powerful, as powerful or even more than Manto's Kholdo. That is the poem that shakes you to the roots, I mean, once you read it, it's transformative. You are sensitized to what hunger is all about, because many of us are privileged enough not even to, before we are hungry for the next meal, the table is laid out for us. But here was a person who was able to imagine hunger in such a way that your bones would wrench with agony with hunger, and the poem that he wrote. So that was one. And just the last point that I want to make as a kind of, paying homage to him, his creativity was enriched by the translations that he was doing. And he always said that, I am writing because others are writing. And this other, the notion of the other, and how to reach the other through the intimacy of the creativity of the other. And what he was therefore seeping was something very unique within himself. And I have been a kind of an admirer of his for a very long time. And I loved to hear from him and get those text messages, Sukrita, I love you. And I know it was not just me, it was all humanity. And he would be writing those messages, and each I love you was throbbing with life the way he would write. My great Shraddhanjali to him.
Thanks, Sukrita ma'am, for so warmly remembering Jayanta. I now request Professor Harish Trivedi ji to please speak. Sir, you need to unmute. Yeah,
that's what I was trying to do. Thank you, Krishna. Jayanta Mahapatra, of course, was one of the most accomplished poets in English that have ever written in India. Person of the highest stature as a poet. But when one knows people in real life, when they have been one's contemporaries, and when they pass away, the loss is felt more in personal terms than in literary terms. One recalls when one first heard of him, when one first read him, when one first corresponded with him, got to know him, and also the last time that one saw him. This was some time ago, in my case, just before COVID, I think. We were together at a conference in Calcutta, and he had been constantly ill. And I had seen him like that before, but I did not like seeing him like that. Because under constant medication, his face had changed. There was a kind of puffiness about him almost permanently, which I'm afraid might have been the effect of very strong medication, steroids. I remembered when he looked very, very different. So there's a kind of a measure in time how one gets to know people in one way and how one progresses with them along the axis of time. He was a very modest man. It's amazing to see someone so modest. He was genuinely modest. He did not need to show that he was modest. And that was a very striking quality about him. I personally connect that with another quality of his, which was even more outstanding, I thought, which was that he was a very desi person in the best sense. He was absolutely homespun. If he was bilingual, it was not because he had acquired another language apart from English, it's because English was his second language. There are not many poets, even of his generation, notable poets, who had grown up in a language other than English. He was an Odia medium poet, Odia medium person. And in that sense, he reached deeper into the life around him than I think many other English poets at that time did. He was translating other Odia poets as soon as he began to publish himself, and not only established poets, but even younger poets, younger than him. Saubhagya Kumar Mishra, for example, who was, I think, 10 or 15 years younger than Jayant. And Jayant was already translating him. Among Jayant's earliest works are translations of Saubhagya. This kind of bilingualism is extremely rare, not only amongst Indian English writers, but even amongst writers in other languages. It's as if one is leading two lives in one. I do not wish to talk about his poetry. There are other people, more competent people, who will do that. I just wish to recall two episodes that in my life that concerned him. I began reading, only one perhaps. I began reading him, I remember, in 1976. That's when our Parthasarthi's anthology came out from Oxford, 10 Indian English poets, 10 20th century Indian poets. This is one kind of vanity that English poets have in India, that they title their books as if they were the only Indian poets. 10 20th century Indian poets. Well, I mean, this was not Jayanta doing it. This was Parthasarthi doing it. And then he began editing Chandrabhaga, which is as important, I think, an achievement of his, as almost as important as the poetry he wrote, because he built up a poetic community. He wrote to me, someone must have mentioned me to him, asking me to contribute some translations. Now, Chandrabhaga again was utterly bilingual. There were as many translations from the Indian languages in that journal as there were poets writing originally in English. And quite early on, I think this is volume 4 of Chandrabhaga, published in 1980, 43 years ago, for which I sent him some translations of Gajanan Madhava Mukti Bodh. And he welcomed them. They were, they were not short translations. They are published from page 2 to page 11, so over 9 pages in this issue. But something quite strange happened. In the poem that I translated, Mukti Bodh wrote very long poems, and even then they were unfinished. And this particular poem that I translated is actually called Meri Lambi Adhuri Kavita, my long unfinished poem. And I chose 2 sections to translate from it, the last 2 sections, and I sent them to Jayant, and he published them. And when the issue came to me and I read it, I realized that there had been a mistake. Then, of course, there was no email. So I had typed it out and kept a copy and sent him one by post. And I found that it was entirely my mistake. The last page of the manuscript, I had not attached with the rest of the manuscript. So it had remained with me, and the rest of it had been published. And I wrote to Jayanta like a fool. I wrote to Jayanta saying this is what had happened. And Jayanta, like a very wise man, said, look, it was a long and unfinished poem. Everybody would expect it to be unfinished. And if it looks unfinished, if it sounds unfinished, that's only very appropriate. Now, this is Jayanta all over. 2 things I learned from this episode from Jayanta. One is, it's already happened. What can you and I do about him? That was the implicit message. And the other, it was just like him, so imaginative, so kind. He was consoling me, so kind and so sympathetic to what had happened, making a virtue of a necessity and tying it up with the content of the poem. It was utterly wonderful. The last thing that I would do is, in the same issue, he also has a poem. And it's dear to me because he and I are both, for the first and only time, within the same covers, as it were. His poem is titled, and this is so characteristic. This is titled, Even If No One Takes My Poems Seriously. Even if no one takes my poems seriously. Yes, he begins, there's a poem growing with a foreign language which keeps my head up. I don't try to explain whether it's the right thing to do or wrong. And then later in the poem, he says, I should like to change myself and the language of my poems so that I could escape my shadow, which keeps dogging me. It's a 1.5-page long poem. And he says, and I can see the younger writers, pointing their holy fingers at me. Don't you, Saubhagya, he says. Same poet whom he has translated, the younger poet, pointing their holy fingers at me, as though I were an alien, simply because I used a foreign language to say what I feel. And it concludes, the last 3 lines, as I sink down wearily on my lover, my sigh shapes itself. The sigh is without a language. My sigh shapes itself into a message which I feel my ancestors are all listening to. I don't need to say what a wonderful poem it is. In making an issue directly, as we say now, problematizing some of the things that he that he worked with all his life. I'll keep reading him and remembering our personal interactions for as long as I'm around. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your memories and emphasizing his competent bilingualism, and also pointing out that English as his second language and Odia is the first. Thanks a lot. अब मैं आदरणीय अरुण कमल जी से अनुरोध करता हूं कि वे अपनी बात करें। सर, आप प्लीज अनम्यूट कर लें।
अब ठीक है। जयंता से पहली बार मेरी मुलाकात करीब 30 साल पहले हुई, आकाशवाणी के कार्यक्रम में दिल्ली में। हम लोग कुछ पहले आ गए थे और अभी समय था तो हम टहलने लगे, और बातचीत में जब उनको मालूम हुआ कि मैं पटना के साइंस कॉलेज में काम करता हूँ, पढ़ाता हूँ, तो रुक गए और उन्होंने बताया कि मैं वहीं से पढ़ा हूँ। मुझको रोमांच आया। जयंता ने पटना यूनिवर्सिटी से, साइंस कॉलेज से फिजिक्स में अपनी पढ़ाई की थी। उसके बाद उन्होंने बताया कि जब गांधी जी की हत्या हुई 30 जनवरी 1948 को, तो वो हॉस्टल में थे, कैवेंडिश हॉस्टल में रहते थे वो, और अचानक सब कुछ बंद हो गया, सब कुछ ठप, पूरा शहर ठप, 2 रोज तक ठप रहा, कहीं खाने को भी कुछ नहीं मिला, अचानक सब बंद हो गया। और जयंता के मुंह से मैंने उस दिन की जो हालत सुनी, वो मैंने अपने पिता से सुनी थी जरूर, लेकिन इतनी गहराई से नहीं सुनी थी कभी। वो उनसे मेरी पहली मुलाकात थी। और तब उन्होंने एक बात और कही थी मुझको, जब मैं अंग्रेजी में उनसे बात करने की मैंने कोशिश की। उन्होंने कहा कि अरुण, मुझको अपनी भाषा में बात करना ऐसे अच्छा लगता है, और लिखने के लिए मैं अंग्रेजी में लिखता हूँ। और हम हिंदी में ही बात करते रहे, उड़िया में जानता नहीं था। और उनसे आखिरी मुलाकात मेरी हुई जब साहित्य अकादमी ने उनको फेलोशिप अर्पित की भुवनेश्वर में, और मुझको उन पर बोलना था और अंग्रेजी में बोलना था। जयंता से वो मेरी आखिरी मुलाकात थी। वो कुछ बीमार थे, अस्वस्थ वो हमेशा रहते थे। जयंता को पढ़ते हुए जो मुझको लगा, जो सबसे खास बात लगी, वो ये कि शायद वो अकेले अंग्रेजी कवि हैं इस देश के जिन्होंने गरीबों, साधारण लोगों, आदिवासियों और जंगल के सौंदर्य के बारे में इतना ज्यादा लिखा। शायद ऐसा अंग्रेजी में ही क्यों, देश की दूसरी भाषाओं में भी ऐसे कवि कम हैं। ये जयंता की कविता की सबसे बड़ी शक्ति थी, और बहुत मार्मिक कविताएं उनकी होती थी। एक कविता उनकी अपने पिता पर है, पितामह पर। वह अद्भुत कविता है, और शायद पितामह पर लिखी वो अकेली कविता है आधुनिक भारतीय भाषाओं में। जयंता की कविता की एक दूसरी बड़ी खूबी ये थी कि उनकी अंग्रेजी कविता को पढ़ते हुए भी जो ये जानते थे कि वो उड़िया भाषी हैं, वो उड़िया के अंतःस्वर को, एक जो पार्श्व संगीत उड़िया भाषा का है, वो लगातार सुन सकते थे। और इसलिए कई बार जो बहुत लोगों ने कहा है, अभी हरीश ने भी कहा, कि वो अंग्रेजी में लिखने वाले उड़िया कवि थे। वो उड़िया कवि थे जो अंग्रेजी में लिखते थे। और यही बात दूसरे ढंग से भी कही जा सकती है कि वो अंग्रेजी में लिखने वाले उड़िया भाषी कवि थे। ऐसे और भी कवि हुए और उनको लटकर भी हुए, दिलीप चित्रे भी हुए, दूसरे लोग भी हुए, लेकिन जयंत महापात्रा में सबसे ज्यादा विश्वास के साथ एक भारतीय भाषा का अंग्रेजी के साथ मिलन होता है। और इसके लिए मुझको हमेशा लगता था कि जयंता ने ये संभव कैसे किया। दूसरी बात उनकी कविता के बारे में मुझको ये भी लगती थी कि उनके यहाँ बिल्कुल नए अछूते बिंब मिलते हैं हमको, जो दूसरे कवियों में कम मिलते हैं। और ये बिंब अक्सर प्राचीन पृष्ठभूमि से, गांवों से, जंगलों से आते हैं। यह भी मुझको सीखने की बात थी। जब जयंता से आखिरी मुलाकात हुई और वो घर जाने के लिए कार में बैठ रहे थे, तो उन्होंने एक बार फिर कहा कि अरुण, तुम कभी मेरे घर नहीं आए। और ये मेरी इच्छा ही रही कि मैं उनके घर जाता। बऊदी का निधन हुआ था, तब भी उन्होंने कहा था और मुझको जानना चाहिए था, लेकिन वो नहीं हुआ। लेकिन जयंता की कविता है और उनका बिल्कुल आखिरी पतला सा संग्रह जो उन्होंने मुझको भेजा था, वो भी मेरे पास है। और कलेक्टेड वर्क्स, जो उनकी कविताएं हैं, कविताओं का समूचा संकलन है वो। तो जयंता बहुत बड़े कवि थे और उनके निधन से संपूर्ण भारतीय कविता को क्षति हुई है। हिंदी कविता को विशेषकर इसलिए कि वो हमारे सबसे करीब के पड़ोसी अंग्रेजी ओडिया कवि थे। मैं अपनी ओर से विनम्र श्रद्धांजलि अर्पित करता हूं। नमस्कार।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद अरुण कमल जी। I now invite Mamang Dai ji to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
You can hear me, no? Thank you,
Yeah.
Krishna ji. I had to kind of update Zoom and do all kinds of things. I thought I would really miss this, but thank you. I'm here just to pay my kind of personal remembrance of Jayanta Da. I first met him in Shillong many, many years ago when we were just starting to write poetry, still unpublished, had never read anything aloud. And we had, Robin Nangom and Desmond was there, all the Shillong poets. And they told me, Mr. Jayanta Mahapatra is here. So at that time, of course, we were not so, at least I was not so aware of how renowned Jayanta Da was. But over the years, he was the man, I think, who opened many doors. And reading his, the book of Doorways, which he had sent to me, it is funny. It's only after someone has left that you begin to realize how great this personality was, And Jayanta Da, I think, was always, he was very kind to all of us. He was always accessible. He was always interested in what we were saying. I went to meet him in Kotak, and he was alone then. I remember thinking he must be feeling quite lonely, but I think Jayanta Da himself always said poetry is a very private, fragile business. And he was busy fussing around, making tea, always bending over backwards, I think, to be, to not kind of frighten you, to encourage you, to give you confidence. He was that type of person. We had some good laughs together. We were in Kolkata in a rather grand hotel for a British Council poetry reading tie-up with some poets from Ireland. And Jayanta Da and I, we met and we felt so happy to recognize each other and say, what are we to do with all the cushions in the room? What are you planning to wear? That was another aspect of Jayanta Da, which I pay tribute to. He really had the wonderment of a child. It was always with him. And I was interested because he was a physicist, and physics and poetry seem to combine somehow. I don't know why, but there is some mysterious element. He always said there is a door in the heart of man which never opens, or if it does at times, we are not aware of its opening. When it does, it goes on to reveal another world, a world where time falls away and space grows. Perhaps the self fills with vastness and light. At the Bangalore Poetry Festival in 2018, I was determined to sit through and really listen to Jayanta Da reading. And I think it was at that time that it really struck me. He was pursuing his conviction. The man was a poet, the poet was a man. I don't know how else to describe him, but it was a very moving reading because you could see the utter conviction, whether you were lonely or you had been hurt or you had suffered so many setbacks, but he was convinced and reading ahead full flow. And the words were so beautiful, the words were so meaningful. So you realize you never know the depth and scope of a person's life, you know. But I think Jayanta Da always had the child in him. He was a poet. What more can I say? And I pay this tribute to a great poet. Rest in peace, Jayanta Da.
Thank you, Maloma. May I now invite Dr. Desmond Karma-Flam. Desmond, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible. Yeah, please.
Okay. Very good afternoon to you all. I consider it a privilege to be part of this meeting where we are gathered to remember one of the greatest poets that our country has produced. I would just like to share briefly the experience of first meeting him. It was in 1986 when I was a very young student at Northeastern Hill University, pursuing my master's in English literature. The university had invited Jayanta Da to do some readings. And I remember with a bunch of my classmates, we had gone down to Shillong Airport to bring him over to the Nehru guest house. When he stepped out of the plane, I saw that he was casually clad in jeans. He had sneakers on. He had a single overnight airbag slung over one shoulder and a Wilbur Smith novel under his arm. That was the first impression that we had of Jayanta Da. And we spent a glorious 3 days, I think, in Shillong, when he was not reading poetry, when he was not engaged in discussing his work, as well as the works of other poets that were invited at that point of time. We were busy roaming the streets of Shillong. And he took profound pleasure in sampling, the street food that was offered at that point of time. So, with this brief recollection of the first experience I have of the meeting with Jayanta Da, me and my students here, we have prepared a song which we believe will be a source of comfort for Jayanta Da as his soul makes its way across the afterlife. And the song is called Sailing. I am sailing. I am sailing home again across the sea. I am sailing stormy waters to be near you, to be free. I am flying like a bird across the sky. I am flying, passing high clouds to be with you, to be free. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? The dark is far away. I am dying, forever crying to be with you. Who can say?
Desmondji, you are not clearly audible. I'm sorry to intervene.
Oh, again, across the sea, I say, stormy waters to be near you, to be free. Oh, Lord, to be near you, to be free. Oh, Lord, to be near you, to be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Desmondji. Although there was some distortion, but it was so nice. Thanks a lot. I now invite Dr. Gaura Haridas ji, distinguished ODI writer and convener of ODI Advisory Board of the Akademi.
Namaskar. Esteemed President of Sahitya Academy, Shri Dr. Madhav Kaushik ji, Secretary Sahitya Academy, and all eminent guests present online, and some of the faces I can see on the screen, and ladies and gentlemen. Someone has said that in every parting, we die a little. With the parting of Jayanta Mahapatra, poetry of Odisha have died rather substantially. Jayanta Mahapatra was the most well-known face outside Odisha as well as India. People of India knew him better than Odisha, and readers outside India understood him still better. His name was enough for a reader of poetry to recognize. For years together, Jayanta Mahapatra Katak was the most significant address of Indian English poetry. Now it is gone. We had lost Manoj Das, another iconic author, 2 years ago. Hardly the wound had been healed. Jayanta Mahapatra passed away. The wound has become fresh and more painful. Like Manoj Das, Jayanta Mahapatra was also a fellow of Sahitya Academy. we used to take pride that Odisha was such a state which had 4 fellows at one time. His demise had taken away that distinction from us. We have become poorer. Jayanta Mahapatra was very close to Sahitya Akademi. He was the first Indian poet to win Sahitya Akademi Award for English poetry in 1981. And he never forgot that, even though he had received so many awards abroad. He never said no to an invitation of Sahitya Akademi. He loved Sahitya Akademi and had never thought of returning his award, as some people thought, though he had some issues with Padma Shri. Jayanta Mahapatra was a lonely man in the crowd. This loneliness has its root in his childhood days. His grandfather was converted to Christianity during the Great Famine of 1866. Like his grandfather, his grandmother was also subjected to humiliation at the hands of some missionaries. Jayanta never forgot them, and these things appeared again and again in his poetry. These had a tremendous psychological impact on him. His neighbors around him all were Hindus. They were keeping distance from Christian Jayant. Jayant started writing late when he was 38, but neither his father nor mother appreciated his hobby, writing poetry. This made him more sad and alienated. His mother took out his diary and destroyed it. Since he wrote in English, contemporary critics of Odia literature didn't give much importance to Jayanta Mahapatra. Since he was a teacher of physics and not literature, he was not taken seriously. He has written all this in his autobiography. Jayanta was not a bright student in his schools because he never enjoyed his studies. But gradually, he changed his mind and he set an example, and he stood one among the 10 best students of his school. Though started late, Critical Quarterly of England published 7 of his poems in one issue, and Jayanta Mahapatra became eminent overnight. It was followed by the Poetry Magazine of America. Jayanta Mahapatra was then invited to Chicago, and the rest of the part is known as history. Someone has written, the primary poetry of Mahapatra is an ironic reflection on past and current religious, cultural, and social life. The poet's attempt to extract meaning from his emotional and intellectual existence is often shown in Odia culture. He uses Odia life as the emotional millstone for his poetry. Jayanta Mahapatra has written poems in Odia too, besides stories in English and editing Chandrabhaga magazine. His autobiography reads like another anthology of poems. He has witnessed some of the historic events in his 95-year-long life, and some of them are First World War, Second World War, India getting independence, assassination of Gandhi, partition of India, assassination of JF Kennedy, Indo-Pak War, landing of Neil Armstrong on moon, etc. He has placed all these in his poems too. Jayanta Mahapatra is no more, but his legacy will live on for years. He was close to old and young, and closer to younger ones. I am fortunate enough that the poet had asked me to write 3-4 lines on the blurb of his autobiography and speak a few words on this book at a book launching ceremony at Bhubaneswar. Jayanta Mahapatra was present, and how happy he was. He had sent me a letter appreciating my words, which now I preserve as a priceless treasure of my life. I would conclude my words with 2 lines of a poem. I quote, we love you more than yesterday, but our love of today can never be more than tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gaura Haridaji. I now invite Professor Subodh Sarkar, eminent English poet, critic, and translator.
Thank you, Krishna ji. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's you just one correction, not English poet. I write in Bengali.
Eminent Bengali poet. Subodhji, there is some disturbance again.
Short with me.
We can't hear you properly. I assume that it is the problem with the net connection. We can't hear you, sir. Hello?
I think.
Yeah, some net connection problem, connectivity problem.
In the meantime, you can call someone else.
Yeah, and again, yeah, sure. Adharaniya Chandrakant Patil.
Can you hear me?
Now he has come back. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Please continue.
Okay. Okay. I have a short poem. The poem I wrote just the next night. Translated this poem yesterday. First, I read out this poem as my tribute to Jayanta, and then it is followed by a very short note recording some of my observations. The poem is called For Jayanta. There was an angel behind the tree at Tinkonia house. The angel whispered the poems. Jayanta wrote them down in ink, sometimes in dew, sometimes in tears. The angel used to sing jingles. When I was sitting at the corner of his bed, where his beautiful wife sat to sing in joy, Jayanta told me a song in 2 lines can erase the agony.
Excuse me, sir, there is yet another problem with connection, perhaps.
I ask you. Oh, you can't hear?
No.
Hello?
Hello?
Can't you hear me?
Now we can hear you, yeah. But the problem has been occurring intermittently.
I can hear. Hello?
Sir.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you. No.
Oh my God. I was almost in the middle of the... Did you hear the poem? The first... I don't know. Jayanta, you never used any laptop, any typewriter to write poems. I have your handwritten poems with me. They are the black diamonds of our destiny. You wrote your will, which said, don't take down you may Bhaga, that we can write. July is singing the poem Diamonds of Our Destiny.
Sir, if you allow, we will wait for some time. Then again, I will invite you. ठीक, अभी आदरणीय चंद्रकांत पाटिल जी से मैं अनुरोध करता हूं कि वे अपनी बात करें.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sir. Please continue.
So things have been told about Jayanta. I have very little to say about him. First I met him, and that was only once in Cuttack, and I was so deeply impressed by his innocence as well as his gentle attitude towards me. Jayantji, no doubt, I once only met him, but I knew him since 80s. There was one thing that happened with me. Some of the poems were collected in one of his anthologies, The False Start, in 1980. And it must be remembered, and I clearly remember that particular book, The False Start, which was published by a group of 4 poets from Bombay through the through their newly established publishing house, Clearing House. I remember the cover of that book, which was designed by Arun Koletkar. Like Jayanta, Arun was also a bilingual poet. But the only thing that differentiates both of them is Arun started writing in Marathi and English simultaneously. But Jayanta started writing in Odia very late. His first Odia collection of poetry, as I remember, published in at the age of 65. It was very late, but was deeply rooted in the culture and social milieu of Cuttack as well as in the Odia side. When he started writing, we see that there was a metamorphosis occurring in the Indian poetry seen in almost all the regional languages. We remember a large number of poets from Bengali, like Shankar Ghosh and Neelamani Fukan from Assam, Arun Koletkar from Marathi, K. Ayappa Panikar from Malayalam, and a number of poets from Hindi, like Narayan Ji, Raghuveer Sahai, and Kedarnath. Although a lot of things were happening in the regional poetry, Jayanta's poetry in those days was getting published in Western journals, and they were highly appreciated by the West and also in some circles here in India. I remember Jayanta's language must have been a product of his discipline from physics or science, precise and exact use of words, and the economy of words was a highly special thing to him. I remember another teacher of physics, a professor of physics, Nicanor Parra, from Latin American, Chilean poet from Latin American countries. And I remember that in one of the interviews, he advocated, particularly to the younger generation, that the generation, those poets, young poets, must read the Latin American poetry of Neruda and others. Nicanor Parra was also one of them. But there was a lot of difference in Parra's anti-poetry and the Jayanta's poetry, although he called all poems, good poems are anti-poems. The uniqueness of his, what I consider as his uniqueness is he, in spite of being an internationally known poet, refused to stay in metropolitan and remained in a small town like Cuttack. So he was quite away from the metropolitan fashional modernity. And he got deeply rooted in the soil of Cuttack and Bhubaneswar and all the Odia. He wrote about the temples, about the culture, about the poverty, the hunger, and socio-economic problems. I believe that writing on persons doesn't heal anything and doesn't give anything offer to readers. But if the poet is not in touch with the social media, the poetry doesn't have any significance. Finally, by altering few words from a well-known poet, Dylan Thomas, I offer, I say, through poets be lost, though poets be lost, poetry shall not, and death shall have no dominion. This is very true about Jayanta. I offer my sincere, my sincere my feeling, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chandrakant Patilji. I now invite Professor Jatendra Kumar Naik.
Thank you. Am I audible, Krishna ji?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
I thank Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to pay a heartfelt tribute to Jayanta Mahapatra, a great poet. And I take this opportunity to reminisce about him because I knew him as a teacher of physics in Ravenshaw College in the 1970s when we didn't know that he was a poet. One day, I think Professor Sipke Kumar in 1974 came to Ravenshaw College to inaugurate a function. And there he suddenly said that in Ravenshaw, you have one of the greatest Indo-Anglian poets. So we all got shocked. We never knew that this teacher of physics had written poems which had earned him such great fame. And later, we became aware of his the great prestige he had earned as a poet who wrote in English. And got to know him personally. And around that time, again in the 1970s, not many people know that he co-edited a journal titled The Grey Book. I think only 3 issues came out. And even there, like Professor Trivedi said, they are publishing translations, they are publishing essays on the great American sculptor Dame Barbara Hepworth, on all about H. Hatter. So that was the precursor of Chandrabhaga. He was always trying to do something. He was not just a dreamy-eyed poet. He was constantly honing his skills. He began as a translator of Fakir Mohan Senapati's short stories. He wrote a school textbook, True Tales of Adventure, in 1970s. He was constantly honing, sharpening his skills. And it was this commitment, intense commitment to craft, which characterizes his poetry, something that his humility, his self-effacing quality as a person blinds us to, that he was fiercely committed to craft and he was constantly sharpening it. And the other aspect of Jayanta Mahapatra that we became increasingly more aware of was his compassion. His poetry is actually rooted in compassion. In his autobiographical excerpt, I think he wrote a 10,000-word autobiographical piece in Encyclopedia of Autobiographies published in the USA. Even there, he talks about the goats being led, bleating to the slaughterhouse in Cuttack. That's the sound he remembers from his childhood. So his compassion even extends to animals. So, and his first poem, I think his first published poem, British Cemetery at Balasore, is again suffused with this compassion. It talks about young girls, British girls who died at the age of 17 or 19, and the headstones talk about the number of years they lived. They had lived. So the compassion characterizes this intense compassion combined with his intense kind of language experience. These, I think, define his poetry in a way nothing else does. And many others talked about his rootedness. I think he was a rooted cosmopolitan. He was deeply rooted in Cuttack. But that rootedness didn't lead to any narrowness of outlook. His outlook on life was very, very cosmopolitan. So at a literature festival, I once asked him, 2019, I asked him, why did a poet like you, who enjoys such international celebrity, why did you decide to spend your entire life in Cuttack, in a small town? Then he gave a memorable answer only a poet of Jayanta Mahapatra's stature can give. He said, my mother told me that as a child I used to eat the earth, the clay of Cuttack. I'm sure the clay must have tasted sweet, so I could never tear myself away from Cuttack. I remained committed to Cuttack. So that was a memorable answer to my question. I thought he would talk about abstractions, he would talk about other great things, but he chose to answer it in such a humble and sweet manner that it's the taste of the clay of Cuttack, the earth soil of Cuttack, that kept him tied to this little world, this small world, and he never regretted that. And just before he died, a month before he died, I met him at his residence in Tinikonia Bagicha, and he was sleeping absolutely alone. And he woke up when he saw me and my son and another friend. And then he was so full of life and vitality, energy. It seemed as if he would live for another 5-10 years. And he talked to me excitedly about his plan to visit Bhopal, because he was all set to go to that international literature conference to his Dr. Rao had invited him. He said, I'll take an escort and I'll go to Bhopal. And I said, I will also be there. Let's travel together. But unfortunately, within a day or two, he took ill and couldn't go to Bhopal. And the rest, you all know that he died soon afterwards, in a month's time. And even then, he was talking about his having read 250 pages from Crime and Punishment. That was the zest for life. That was a zest for life. And capacity for friendship is kindness, which extended to everyone, particularly the young. Every young man, woman was inspired by him. He always had plenty of time to spare for the young, encourage them. I always said that it's impossible to imitate him, though we all adored him. So we can never coin phrases like him. We can never acquire that kind of command of language. And we remember him with great fondness. There is a great void which his death has left in our lives, in the world of poetry, and we'll all miss him sorely. And his memory will always be cherished by us. So with these words, I pay my heartfelt homage to one of the greatest poets and a wonderful human being. So this combination of humanity and poetic genius is what will always, this memory of this will remain forever fresh in our minds. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jatin Nayak. I request now Professor Subodh to speak, to whom we couldn't hear, perhaps. Subodh, sir.
Yes, thank you, Krishna. I hope this time you can hear me.
Yeah.
I have a passed away. The next night I wrote this poem, and I translated this poem yesterday to read here. So the poem is called For Jayanta.
Oh, unfortunately, the problem occurred again. No, sir, we can't hear you. The problem occurred again. And now I'm sure it's with the internet connectivity. No, sir, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Let us stop again for a while. May I now invite Professor Ashwani Kumarji.
Am I audible, Krishnaji?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Let me first thank Madhav Kaushik ji, Kesari Nivas Rao ji, and Sahitya Academy for giving me opportunity to share my remembrance, personal and also literary, about Jayanta Mahapatra and Jayanta. I would like to express very briefly in two modes of sharing my remembrance. The first form is personal. Since his death, many people have been sharing, particularly people close to him, his friends, his students, about his personal life. And many people knew Jayanta Mahapatra for decades, 5 decades, 6 decades. Many have grown with Jayanta. In my case, I met Jayanta Mahapatra, Jayanta late in his life and mine, but we shared our hunger for a language of our own, not because we were writing in English, but largely because we shared the same mimetic landscape of memories and languages. Jayanta used to tease me, saying, "You are a Keonjhar boy, born in the backyard of Odisha, Bihar, so you can't escape me, Ashwini." But since I am a Bombay poet, I also became like the sea for him, reminding him the Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. And when I started curating Chandrabhaga Poetry Festival, it became a ritual sort of thing, for me to be there with Jayanta on everyday basis, sharing its joys and sorrows in the last several years. Soon our friendship grew into such an intimate, beautiful poem that the last message that I received from Jayanta on 13th August, in the message it says, Ashwini, love is as strong as death. Its jealousy as unyielding as the grave. Love you always. And this love became so intense, I must confess to all of you, that while he wanted to release, and there was some sense for him that it would be his last book, The Noon, in May this year, he insisted that Ashwini, you must come. I went there and released his Noon and also a coffee table book and a documentary on Jayanta. So Jayanta has been such a wonderful, intimate friend, and that, and on some other occasion, I would talk about it, a relationship, a friendship, which also almost resembled like the relationship between W.H. Auden and Hannah Arendt, but I leave it for some other occasion. Coming back here to the importance and the significance of Jayanta Mahapatra as a poet, as an Indian poet, Jayanta is remembered as also someone so profoundly important for the poetry in India because he unsettled linguistic and cultural conventions of a suspect, what I call suspect Anglophone poetry in the country. Jayanta Mahapatra's ascent, the rise in Indian poetry landscape coincided with the twin forces of decolonization and democracy. In far more important sense, in fact, Jayanta helped us to decolonize Indian poetry from the imperial and colonial influences. Unlike unhomely and culturally uprooted Baroque Anglophone poetry, Jayanta Mahapatra's fluorescent and flamboyant verses were deeply rooted into his native world, his fabled Tinkunia Bagicha home, Chandrabhaga. Like David Walcott, every poem of Jayanta Mahapatra is about the land and landscape of people. If sea is history for Walcott in the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry is born out of a hunger for rain of rights in the fallow fields of Dhauli in Odisha. Everything is called sacred in my land, even poems. He avers shyly. No wonder he is not just national poet of Odisha, but also national poet of India. Once you start reciting his poems, rivers of Odisha swell like pregnant women, and we pluck the first line of Odyssey in trance, as if we are sailing at the edge of rains for the lustful experience of an unknown monsoon melody. That is why Jayanta Babu's poems are a kind of music, nothing that you can hear in the silence everywhere, and then more silence in his own words. He is deeply political. Undoubtedly, he is deeply political, but he will never screams, because in his own words, ashes of songs, the baying of hounds, the vomit of iron haunts you with such liquid, languid ferocity that you are stunned and also bewildered simultaneously. While accepting that human beings inevitably seek to achieve life's purpose, Jayanta takes the skeptical position that the natural world remains silent about any such redemption. Since existence is fragile, easily perishable, even in bright sunshine, Jayanta speaks of dying, silence of the real, like a fertile emptiness arising out of vast expanse of memories. In other words, Jayanta Babu amongst us is a supreme exponent of human fallibility, vulnerability, and a rare mode of solitude, a solitude that is a strange abode of fire and flame held together by streams of illumination, recalls his famous Puri poems. In fact, Jayanta Mahapatra is a pilgrim poet, searching the secret places of the heart while spreading Promethean fire wherever he travels. Like Kalidasa, Jayanta places himself in the ancient Indian tradition of poet-seers who see themselves as speaking the truth like recurring prayers, shifting from lips to lips, linking the ephemeral and chimerical bodies for a test of tomorrow. In this primordial struggle with languages of bodies, Jayanta has inflicted on himself deep wounds, but he has also remained unstrained by the bleeding joys of self and soul. This is the Indian in me, he says, but he does not know, quote, where does it all begin? No poet is more apt than Jayanta Mahapatra, who creates what I call a metaphysics of realism, a strange form of burdened nothingness which puts his language to the point of disintegration, where he listens to the rains murmur on Odisha's jungle of tall salt, and also laments on hunger in Somalia. Poetic language or Jayantava has the potential to free us from the instrumental use of language. Thus, it is a poet's obligation to retrieve arbitrary truths from the void of forgetfulness and reveal the mysteries of memories. Jayanta, I always called him a wandering akshav of Indian poetry. He is epic, even in miniature, concealed in the intimate mysteries of life. With transgressive thrills and mischievous provocation, Jayanta Mahapatra quietly and delightfully invented a uniquely personal language specific to his poetry and his people. What is striking about his poetic resonance, or what I call dhwani, is the exceptional intensity of rasa, or aesthetic enjoyment of rapture, etched in our memory, like the mating songs of peacock and kingfisher. And he beguiles us with his map of a country one has never visited, and to find one's way, one needs only know how to read the map in his own words. This elevation of sensuality in Janta's poems reaches apotheosis of life in the sense of what I call Sakhi Bhav, like Jayadev's Geet Govind, where lovers' attraction, estrangement, and final reconciliation become enigmatic devotional experiences of life. I would not be surprised if Jayanta Mahapatra's poems are sung in temples during festivals and at kirtanas all over India. Jayanta Mahapatra is no more. And to quote W.H. Auden, wonder what you have missed. I quote Jayanta's, the stillness that plays on with the pulsing of butterflies, what the elusive wings, dawn and dusk. Thank you, Sahitya Akademi, for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Ashwini Kumarji, for so fondly remembering Jayanta and pointing out so many significant aspects of his beautiful poetry. Thanks a lot. अब मैं आदरणीय डॉक्टर माधव कौशिक जी, अध्यक्ष साहित्य अकादमी को अपनी बात कहने के लिए निमंत्रित कर रहा हूं। डॉक्टर माधव कौशिक जी।
नमस्कार, मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
जी सर जी।
मित्रों, वाकई पूरा भारतीय साहित्यिक समाज जयंत महापात्रा जी के निधन से सच में बड़ा शोकाकुल है। जयंत महापात्रा जी की स्थिति तो पितामह जैसी थी हम सब के लिए। जैसे परिवार का सबसे बड़ा मुखिया, आयु में भी और जो उनका साहित्यिक अवदान है उसके हिसाब से भी वो सच में बहुत बड़े थे। 2008 से लेके 2023 तक इन 15-16 वर्षों में जब मैं साहित्य अकादमी के साथ जुड़ा, मैंने कभी ऐसा नहीं पाया कि जयंत महापात्रा जी को आमंत्रित किया और वो ना आए। साहित्य अकादमी के हर आयोजन में वो आते थे। यहाँ तक कि उनकी कई बार सेहत भी ठीक नहीं होती थी और हम खुद चिंतित होते थे। कई बार कह भी देते थे, सर अगर हिम्मत नहीं है, नहीं साहित्य अकादमी के लिए मैं ठीक हूँ। हमेशा उन्होंने आया। और जो बात अरुण कमल जी ने बताई महात्मा गांधी के उस हत्या पे और पटना के उन दिनों के बारे में, वही बातें जयंत महापात्रा जी ने हमारे साहित्य अकादमी के एक आयोजन में भी शेयर की थी। उनकी कविताओं का अनुवाद हिंदुस्तान की हर भाषा में हुआ है। तो मेरे विचार से जयंत महापात्रा, चाहे वो उड़िया में लिखते थे या अंग्रेजी में लिखते थे, वो भारतीय तमाम भाषाओं के एक तरह से सर्वश्रेष्ठ कवियों में से एक है। भारतीय इस महाकवि में दो बातें आप सबने उनके साहित्य को पढ़ा, बचपन से विद्यार्थी जीवन से हम भी पढ़ते आ रहे थे। दो बातें जो खास तौर पे नजर आती थी, ही इज द रियल सन ऑफ सोयल, असली धरती पुत्र जिसे कहना चाहिए। केवल मिट्टी से जुड़ा हुआ नहीं, उनके सारे मेटाफर, उनकी इमेजरी, उनकी पूरी कविताएं आप पढ़ते जाइए, आपको लगेगा जैसे पिक्टोरियल क्वालिटी तो ऐसी थी कि आपको लगता था कि मैं कविता पढ़ नहीं रहा, कविता को देख रहा हूं। कई बार ऐसी भी स्थितियां थी। तो जयंत महापात्रा जी का जो निधन है, वाकई भारतीय साहित्य ने एक ऐसा बड़ा लेखक खो दिया जो सच में स्पोक्समैन ऑफ द कॉमन मैन जिसे हम कह सकते हैं, आम आदमी का, आम भारतीय का एक ऐसा प्रवक्ता जो अपनी भारतीयता से बहुत प्यार करता था। और उन्होंने दो काम बड़े आसानी से किए। उड़िया और अंग्रेजी के बीच उन्होंने सेतु का काम किया, एक ऐसे पुल का काम किया। इसी तरह क्लासिकल एक्सीलेंस और मॉडर्निटी के बीच का भी उन्होंने काम किया। और एक बात जो सबसे बड़ी उनमें नजर आती थी, जब जयंत महापात्रा जी से मैं पहली बार 2008 में मिला, तो ज्ञान का भी एक आतंक होता है। मेरे मन में बड़ी झिझक थी मिलते हुए कि भाई इतना बड़ा महाकवि, पता नहीं हमें हमसे बात करेंगे या नहीं। उस जमाने में सुनील गंगोपाध्याय जी हमारे प्रेसिडेंट होते थे। तो मुझे अब भी याद है, उन्होंने उतने प्यार से मिला, उतने प्यार से बातें की, उतने प्यार से सिखाया कि वाकई एक छोटा आदमी भी जब उनसे मिलता था, छोटा लेखक या नया लेखक भी मिलता था, तो वो अपने आप को बड़ा अनुभव करता था। उनके सामने जाके किसी ने छोटा अनुभव किया हो, मुझे याद नहीं आता। 2019 में हमारे गौरहरि जी के प्रतिष्ठान का एक आयोजन था, मुझे अब भी याद है, संवाद का। उसके बाद उत्कल साहित्य समाज का भी एक आयोजन था। हालांकि उनकी तबीयत खराब थी, तो भी वो हर आयोजन में उनके साथ थे, हर आयोजन में साथ रहते थे। और एक तरह से उनसे मिलना एक आशीर्वाद ग्रहण करने जैसा था। तो मित्रों, जयंत महापात्र जैसे कवि, कबीर की एक पंक्ति मुझे याद आई, हम न मरई मरई संसारा। संसार मर सकता है, बड़ा कवि कभी नहीं मरता। और वो बेशक दैहिक रूप से हमारे सामने ना हो, लेकिन कविताओं के जरिए वो हमारे सामने रहेंगे, हमारे साथ रहेंगे, हमें प्रेरित और प्रोत्साहित करते रहेंगे और आने वाली पीढ़ी को एक बात और समझाते रहेंगे। बेशक आप दुनिया की सबसे बड़ी जबान में लिखें, लेकिन आपके पांव जमीन पे होने चाहिए, आपकी आंखें उसी को देखनी चाहिए जो आपका अपना है, जो आपकी सभ्यता है, आपकी संस्कृति है। आप उसी के प्रवक्ता बन के आगे बढ़ेंगे तो आपकी कदर संसार में सबसे अधिक होगी। मैं ऐसे महानायक, महापात्र एक तरह से हमारे साहित्य के महानायक उन कवियों में से हैं जिनके दम पे भारतीय कविता अपने आप को गौरवान्वित भी अनुभव करती है, सम्मानित भी अनुभव करती है। मैं भारत के 24 भाषाओं के सभी तमाम रचनाकारों की तरफ से, कवियों की तरफ से, बुद्धिजीवियों की तरफ से उनको हार्दिक श्रद्धांजलि अर्पित करता हुआ ईश्वर से प्रार्थना करता हूँ कि उनकी स्मृति हमेशा हमारे साथ रहे और उनकी कविताएं हमारा मार्गदर्शन करती रहे। जय हिंद, ओम शांति।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर। Jayanta made the world that he encapsulated with great sensitivity and profound worldview in his poetry immortal. We will certainly miss him. और जैसा कि आदरणीय माधव कौशिक जी ने कहा, भले ही दैहिक रूप से हमारे साथ वे न हों, मगर उनकी कविता हमेशा हमारे साथ रहेगी। Sahitya Akademi pays its sincere tributes to dear Jayanta and hearty thanks to you all for joining in and paying your tributes to the great distinguished poet. Thanks a lot. The meet ends here. Thanks a lot.